Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Chapter 16. We are jumping into the sympathetic division. So in the first overview video, you should now have a comfortable understanding of kind of where in the nervous system we're talking about, what the autonomic nervous system controls. Remember, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. And then the sympathetic division was our fight or flight or freeze or exercise. So all of those kind of unique experiences during short periods of time, these crisis modes or exercise, those smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands are going to be regulated by the sympathetic division. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about in this video. So this first diagram is kind of a schematic of showing you the different locations of where that preganglionic and postganglionic neuron meet, and then where are the effectors located in the body, because it is the location of synapse, which is the ganglia, and the location of the target tissue, which kind of determines this pathway of where these neurons are going to go. So in one of the earlier slides from the overview lecture, we talked about that lateral gray horn being located in the T1 to L2 segment of the spinal cord. So the sympathetic preganglionic neurons are only located in the lateral gray horn of sections T1 to L2 of the spinal cord. I know that's a lot of information, so pause and go back if you need to. So lateral gray horns of T1 to L2 for sympathetic preganglionic neurons. Okay, so then that first motor neuron leaves the spinal cord and it will find itself synapsing with the postganglionic fiber in one of three places. We have what we call the chain ganglia or the sympathetic ganglia. We have what are called collateral ganglia, and they have their own anatomical names. We'll get to those later. And then the third option is the suprarenal medulla. It's the very middle of the adrenal gland. So these are the three places where you can have the pre and the post meet up outside of the central nervous system. Remember, a ganglion is the term that refers to a collection of cell bodies physically outside of the brain and spinal cord in the peripheral nervous system. All right, so that's the location of synapsing. That location of synapses gives you clues to where that postganglionic fiber is going to go. So if you happen to synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglia, so I'm writing a box around that right now, your effectors, your visceral effectors, remember smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, will be in a couple different places. This is probably the widest distribution of effectors. So we have the thoracic cavity. So think about what kind of organs are in the thoracic cavity. Heart and lungs, those are the biggies. So that's all your cardiac muscle is found in your heart. And there's lots of smooth muscle in your blood vessels in the heart, in all of the blood vessels to your lungs, your pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins, all of the smooth muscle around your bronchioles for bronchodilation, bronchoconstriction. There's lots of glands, secretory glands for mucus in your thoracic cavity. Your head, right? Smooth muscle and glands in your head. Body wall, so that's like your trunk, right? Front and back. And your limbs, arms and legs. Okay, so if you have a smooth muscle, a cardiac muscle, or a gland in any of those places, that postganglionic fiber was communicated to by its preganglionic fiber in the sympathetic chain ganglia. That's where they had their synapse. Okay, if the pre and post meet up in the one of the collateral ganglia, we are limited to the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, not that that's a small thing, because we have a ton of organs in your abdominal pelvic cavity. So think all the digestive system, all of the urinary system, all of the reproductive system, all of those visceral organs, guts and stuff, right? That's all found in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the whole digestive tract is surrounded by smooth muscle. You've got a ton of glands in your abdominal pelvic cavity. The only thing you don't have is cardiac muscle, because that's only found in the heart. And then the last one, I'm calling it the weird one. So you can remember to call it weird if you want to, because it's a very, I guess weird wouldn't be the right word. It's very specific. It is going only to the adrenal medulla, and it does something different. It doesn't communicate directly to organ, but what it does is it sends neurotransmitter, in this case, they actually act as hormones, via circulation. And we'll see a little bit more about this when we go through these different synapsing locations more specifically. So if you synapse in the chain ganglia, your target will be head, neck, body wall, and limbs, and thoracic cavity. If you synapse in the collateral ganglia, your target will be in the abdominal pelvic or cavity. If you synapse in the supraadrenal medulla, your targets are pretty much the whole body via circulation, because the epinephrine and norepinephrine go into circulation. All right, so this is more of a schematic, doesn't have a lot of pictures and realism to it, but it's kind of good because it breaks it down pretty straightforward. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the various pathways, the roadways, if you will, however you want to think about it, the potential ways that these pre and post ganglionic neurons go from that lateral gray horn to their ultimate destination. Okay, so we did a little bit of this back in chapter 13 with the distribution of motor neurons. So if you want to go back and reflect on that, you can. That would have been the lecture, if you remember my little animated lightning bolts that kind of zipped around through like your anterior root, your posterior root, and your spinal nerve, and the rami communicantes and the ventral rami and the dorsal rami. That is kind of what we're talking about here. So if you remember back then, I said, we're going to need this in the autonomic nervous system. Well, here we are. So we're going to repeat some of that information. So if you wanted to go back to chapter 13 or rewatch that video to get some foundation, feel free to do that. So we have these three places, right? So here's our sympathetic chain, our collateral, and our suprarenal medulla. I have them all three on one place, but I'm going to go through each one of them individually. We're going to start with the sympathetic chain. All right, so they have color-coded the neurons. So red is our preganglionic neuron that starts in the central nervous system and synapses in the chain ganglia. The black is our ganglionic neuron, which we call the postganglionic fiber, which is the axon, that will leave that chain ganglia and go find its target. Now, if you remember what we just looked at in that schematic was the target was head, body wall, limbs, and thoracic cavity. Okay, so those could be our potential destinations. Now, within this one synapsing location of the sympathetic chain, there could be some variation as to how that path goes. So we're going to first of all take a look at kind of these top three. What I say, head, neck, body, wall, and limbs. Basically head, body wall, front and back, and your arms and legs. So let's say we have a visceral effector. What's a good visceral effector? Let's say goosebumps, right? It's cold, goosebumps happen because it's winter. So goosebumps, erector pili muscle, right, is a smooth muscle, and that's found on the surface of your skin, which is also found in your head, neck, body, wall, and limbs, because all those places are covered with skin and hair. I almost said fur because I'm thinking of my cats. So let's say we are getting cold or frightened, since it's sympathetic activation, fight or flight, and we need to send a message to the erector pili muscle on your arm. Okay, so I'm wearing a sweater today, so I don't have goosebumps at the moment, but. So we are going to start, let me get a highlighter here. So we're going to start at the lateral gray horn. With our preganglionic motor neurons, that's going to be starting right here. I'm highlighting that. It's going to go out the anterior root, right? Because all the front half of the spinal cord is motor control, right? So anterior root, it goes into the spinal nerve, okay? Spinal nerve, we didn't touch a lot on these before, but we had the rami communicantes, right? So we had that term back in chapter 13. Now we're going to split that and look a little bit more detail at the white ramus and the gray ramus. So, all right, so we have our red preganglionic neuron going to the spinal nerve and then down the white ramus. And so this is where it is synapsing in the ganglia, okay, in the sympathetic chain ganglia. And the goal, again, is to get to the head, neck, body, wall, and limbs, or my erector pili muscle on my arm, okay? So now we have our synapse. So from pre to post, we have the release of neurotransmitter activating the postganglionic neuron. I'll use green for my color because black would just be totally overwhelming. So now the path of this postganglionic neuron, the fiber, is going to leave the chain ganglia and go up the gray ramus. Okay? And then it's going to kind of loop around and go out the spinal nerve to the destination of wherever my arm is. So if you go back to chapter 13, when we were learning about the branching of this pathway, if I'm talking about my arm, that's my head, neck, body, wall, and limbs, not the back or the anterior thorax, I guess. So that branch would go in the ventral ramus. So it would eventually go out the ventral ramus, hook up with a nerve that will then go and communicate to my erector pili muscle, telling it to contract and giving me goosebumps. Okay? So that's going to be the same path for your head, your neck, your anterior body wall, and your limbs. If it's a goosebump on your back, it would just go out the posterior ramus or the dorsal ramus. But that's just a split at the ramus past the spinal nerve. Either way, this is the path of getting your visceral communication from your spinal cord out to an effector, head, neck, body, wall, and limbs. Okay. The preganglionic neuron synapses to the postganglionic neuron and the chain ganglia. The postganglionic neuron leaves the spinal nerve, then goes to its destination based on where that's going to be. Okay. So I'll delete that. Now you might notice there is a kind of a second synapsing here. It's not a second synapse, it would be an option instead of synapsing in the chain ganglia at the same level. So say this was like T5. If it's T5, you might have, so this is oops, let me get the right color here. This would be T5 spinal segment. This would be T5 chain ganglia, and maybe this is T4. Okay, so it's a level above it. There's no rule to say the preganglionic neuron at T5 has to synapse with the postganglionic neuron in chain ganglia T5. It can travel up or down the chain and synapse with the postganglionic neuron to go somewhere else. So this is just showing you that option, not that the preganglionic neuron actually splits and synapses in both T5 and T4 chain ganglia. It's just going to be one or the other. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. So there's your head, neck, body, wall, and limbs. Now, what if we wanted to send a message to the smooth muscle for bronchodilatations, right? So you're exercising, you need more airflow, you're in sympathetic activation because you're exercising. So what do we do to go and vasodilate, or not vasodilate, bronchodilate the smooth muscle? Well, vasodilate too, but let's just say our destination is going to be smooth muscle in the thoracic cavity, right? So thoracic cavity, visceral organs, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, all of those can be found in the thoracic cavity. So let's take a look. Let's follow that pathway. Again, we're starting, let me get highlighter. We are starting with our lateral gray horn, preganglionic neuron, traveling out the ventral root, spinal nerve, white ramus. So far, so good. That's the same as what we just covered. But take a now look at the postganglionic neuron. So here's our synapse. And instead of looping back up with the gray ramus, it's going to leave and head towards the thoracic cavity via a structure called a sympathetic nerve. Okay, it's just another branch that's coming off. So we have a white ramus going into the chain ganglia. We have a gray ramus going out back up to the spinal nerve, and then kind of coming off of one side of that chain ganglia, we have the sympathetic nerve. And that's going to send that postganglionic neuron to the smooth muscle around the bronchioles in my lungs saying, relax, so I can bronchodilate, so I can move more air in and out of my lungs. Okay, so these are the possible locations of synapsing between pre and post of the chain ganglia and their destinations. If your destination is head, neck, body, wall, and limbs, you're going to synapse in the chain ganglia. The postganglionic neuron will get to its target via the spinal nerve. If your target is in the thoracic cavity, you will synapse in the chain ganglia, and the postganglionic neuron will head to the destination via a sympathetic nerve. Okay, so that's our chain ganglia. Check. That's one location. Okay, the next one is the collateral ganglia. There's three collateral ganglia. There's a celiac, a superior mesenteric, and an inferior mesenteric. We'll see that on a diagram here in a little bit. So right now, we're going to generally call them collateral ganglia. They're located anterior to your spinal column. All right, so if you remember, it is the destination of the abdominal pelvic cavity that synapsing in the collateral ganglia tells us where this message is going, right? So chain ganglia was head, neck, body, wall, limbs, and thoracic cavity. Collateral ganglia, abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so stomach, small intestine, liver, spleen, urinary bladder, uterus, all that stuff. So let's take a look. Let's follow our journey. So we'll start in our lateral gray horn. So that's all the same. We haven't changed that. Preganglionic neuron goes out our anterior anterior root, spinal nerve, white ramus, that's all the same. But here's where we see a major difference. We are not synapsing the chain ganglia, we are bypassing that chain ganglia. So we are going to go out what's now called a splanchnic nerve. It looks very much like a sympathetic nerve, and it functions the same way as a sympathetic nerve, but its destination is the abdominal pelvic cavity, not the thoracic cavity. So that's really the main difference between a sympathetic nerve and a splanchnic nerve. It's just the destination and what kind of neuron you're going to be finding there. So here, preganglionic neuron bypasses the chain ganglia and goes all the way to the collateral ganglia. So this is where we're going to have our synapse. And then the collateral ganglia, or the postganglionic neuron, leaves the collateral ganglia and goes and finds its destination. Smooth muscle in the wall of the stomach, or the whatever. Smooth muscle glands, that's all we have in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay. Now remember, preganglionic neurons are myelinated, postganglionic neurons are unmyelinated. So that's why we still have the white ramus can be considered the white ramus, because it's still preganglionic neurons, myelinated axons. Right? So that's a little bit easier. The chain ganglia has a little bit more complexity to it. So collateral ganglia, you bypass the chain, the preganglionic continues to go via splanchnic nerve to the collateral ganglia. Postganglionic neuron leaves to go find its destination in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay. All right. Our last option, which again is our weird one, it doesn't follow all of the same rules, but we'll kind of follow their path just like we did before. All right, so preganglionic neuron starts in the lateral gray horn, anterior root, spinal nerve, white ramus, bypasses the chain ganglia out. I think it's a splanchnic nerve. I think it's at the level of the digestive or your abdominal pelvic. So preganglionic goes to a collateral, goes through the collateral, bypasses it, no synapse there. And it goes all the way to its destination, in this case, which is the renal medulla. So it's the very middle part of the adrenal gland. And if you'll notice, the postganglionic neuron is just a short little neuron that's already in the medulla of the adrenal gland. And this is a slightly different synapse because it's not so much that the pre is releasing neurotransmitter and it lands on receptors on the postganglionic neuron. That postganglionic neuron are specialized endocrine cells. So the arrival of the action potential from the preganglionic neuron triggers these postganglionic cells to release their neurotransmitters into the bloodstream. That's what makes it weird, because it's not at a synapse. It's sending epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream, which will then affect all of your body tissues, not just the adrenal medulla. Okay, so fight or flight activation, sympathetic activation, you get the direct communication via those postganglionic neurons in the collateral and sympathetic chain pathways. But with the adrenal medulla, you get your epinephrine and norepinephrine dumped in the bloodstream, so your whole body is feeling that sensation. The best example to relate this to real life I can think of is like usually driving can be dangerous. And I've never really been in a major accident before. Just a few, like a fender bender and something like that. But I've had some close calls, and it usually involves animals kind of darting out in front of your car. I did have a kid one time run in front of me, and I had to slam on the brakes. I didn't hit the kid, kind of yelled at him when he got to the sidewalk, but after that moment of the reflex reaction of not hitting the thing in the road, whatever it is, you get kind of that tingly sensation all the way through your body. Your heart starts to beat, you get a little bit clammy. That's the result of the epinephrine dumping into your bloodstream from the adrenal medulla. Adrenaline rush, right? Adrenaline is the same thing as epinephrine. So it's the adrenal gland releases adrenaline, which is epinephrine, and that gives you that full-on like fight or flight sensation. That's what's happening with the adrenal medulla. Okay. All right. So those are our three destinations for, locations, sorry, 3 locations for synapsing between pre and post. All right, so now we have a little bit more realistic of a picture. We started with a schematic, and then we did each individual location. And so now we can try to follow some of these things with a little bit more realistic appearance. So again, I'll go back to my highlighter. So we can see, let's say that erector pili example again. So here's my erector pili over on my skin. Okay. So let's say I have my preganglionic neuron located in the lateral gray horn, goes out the ventral root, spinal nerve, white ramus, synapsing into the chain ganglia. There we go, right there. And then we have the postganglionic neuron going back up the gray ramus, out the spinal nerve, to my erector pili muscle, giving me goosebumps. But we see sweat glands, we see blood vessels, we see adipose tissue. So all of those effectors that are located in the head, neck, body wall, and limbs are going to be communicating via this pathway, via those spinal nerves. Okay. What about our thoracic cavity? So here, if you remember, we had the same kind of pathway. So I'm going to go up here. Preganglionic neuron in the lateral gray horn, ventral root, synapsing, so white ramus, synapsing in the chain ganglia. But then the postganglionic neuron did not go back up the gray ramus to find the spinal nerve. It went out the sympathetic nerve and goes to the heart. So that's my example for this one, going to cardiac muscle tissue. So these are the collections of sympathetic nerves that we just saw, kind of that little tube looking thing sticking off the chain ganglia. So this would be the pathway for your heart and lungs, because those are found in the thoracic cavity. Everything else, head, neck, body, wall, and limbs, are going to go out via the spinal nerve. All right, so now let's take a look at the collateral ganglia synapsing destination. Let's say again, we'll do stomach. All right, so let's say I have my preganglionic neuron, lateral gray horn, ventral root, bypassing through the chain ganglia, splanchnic nerve, right? There's my splanchnic nerve. Here's one of my collateral ganglia. It has a specific name called the celiac ganglia. I'm going to go, oops, sorry, wrong color. I've synapsed. So I've synapsed with my postganglionic neuron. Now I'm going to go and communicate to the smooth muscle of my stomach. In that collateral ganglia, it just happened to be called the celiac ganglia. The other two we have are the superior mesenteric and the inferior mesenteric. We just collectively called them collateral ganglia on the prior slides. Okay. And then our last, again, our weird example was our adrenal medulla. So again, I'll start down here. Preganglionic neuron, bypassing the chain ganglia. Here's our splanchnic nerve, bypassing the celiac ganglia, going all the way down to your adrenal medulla. And then we had those little postganglionic endocrine cells that release the epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. So this may be more helpful to you, seeing it with the actual organs. We can divide, right? Oops, I don't want a highlighter. I'll figure this out. Right? So here is thoracic cavity is up here. So that's going to be sympathetic chain location. And this is your collateral. Oops, what am I trying? I didn't want to change my topic here. So this is your abdominal pelvic. So remember, thoracic cavity, synapsing in the chain ganglia, abdominal pelvic cavity, synapsing in the collateral ganglia. Alrighty, so that is the pathway. That's the distribution of sympathetic innervation. How does the signal get from the central nervous system to the effectors? It depends on the location of synapsing, and it depends on the location of the target tissue. All right, the last topic we're going to take a look at is locations where we actually have synapses, not the adrenal medulla. That's the weird one. So all of the other places where we have the pre and the post communication, the postganglionic fiber goes and finds its effector. Instead of a typical synapse, like what, if you remember, we kind of saw synapse kind of like this, and here's the target tissue. We had the vesicles and the synaptic knob. The neurotransmitter crossed the cleft, it bound to receptors, sodium rushed in, blah, blah, blah. That was chapter 10 and chapter 12 stuff. Our typical neuromuscular junction or neuron to neuron synapse. Well, those postganglionic neurons do not have the typical neuromuscular junction, if you will. they have, instead of synaptic knobs, they have what are called varicosities. So these varicosities are these little bead-like bubbles, like a chain, like almost like a pearl necklace or a beaded chain, and it is inside the varicosities that contain the vesicles that release the neurotransmitter, in this case norepinephrine. So it's still the same idea in that when the action potential comes down, the exocytosis of the neurotransmitter is going to be released, it will cross the synapse, it will bind to the receptor, but it's not just one precise location. It is distributed over a bigger piece of that particular tissue. And again, this is smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. We would never see a varicosity on a skeletal muscle because that is not a visceral effector. Skeletal muscle is somatic. We've already covered that. So now we're focusing on these visceral effectors. So that's why they're showing smooth muscle here as an example, where you would have the release of this neurotransmitter, and it's a lot more distributed, a lot more widespread, giving a kind of a bigger signal to this effector instead of just one location like we would see, say, in a neuromuscular junction of skeletal muscle. Okay, so that's kind of the structural differences between these postganglionic neurons at the synaptic location. The last thing I wanted to talk about are the receptors, the types of neurotransmitters and the receptors. Now, this is a picture from chapter 12. So we did not go over all the neurotransmitters and neuromodulators and stuff from chapter 12, but I did bring this back because some of you may or may not remember from your general bio cell communication information. So we talked about different types of receptors. So enzyme-linked receptors, G protein-linked receptors, ion channel-linked receptors, intracellular receptors. So this is a review of the G protein-linked receptors because, and I put this up here for a reason, because these are the types of receptors that are associated with your epinephrine and norepinephrine neurotransmitters that are released in the sympathetic division, okay? So if you remember in a G protein, you have the receptor, right? This is a purple box. It is associated with an inactive G protein. When you get binding of your ligand, in this case, it would be the neurotransmitter epinephrine or norepinephrine, it binds, the G protein becomes active. I remember in our BI-211, we had the little boomerang. You might remember the boomerang shape kind of goes across the membrane, activates a neighboring enzyme, in this case, adenylate cyclase, which then in turn produces a second messenger. So you might remember second messengers. And then second messengers go and do something in the cell. Sometimes it's activating enzymes, sometimes it's increasing, right? So activates enzymes, changes cell metabolism, or in this case, it can open ion channels, which maybe if it's sodium, it's going to excite the cell, right? So if you have sodium or calcium or any other positively charged ion into the cell, that's going to be an excitatory response. So if you need to go back and review G protein receptors, you can do that. Maybe you can just Google or YouTube a little. I'm going to post some in the special or the helpful links. So you'll have an example of one of these with epinephrine, I think, or norepinephrine, one of the two. But with that, we have to discuss the different types of G protein receptors that are associated with the sympathetic division. We have 5. We have alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. Okay, so this is all listed in your textbook and in the notes. So what I want you to take away from this is not so much the details of the mechanism that's happening, because that's prior knowledge of, G protein receptors, second messengers, and they do stuff in the cell. Excuse me. But what the overall response of the cell is going to be. So for alpha 1s, when epinephrine binds to alpha 1, it produces an excitatory response. So when norepinephrine binds to an alpha 1, if you're on smooth muscle, the smooth muscle is going to contract. If you're on a gland, the gland's going to secrete. If you're in the cardiac muscle cell, it's going to contract, maybe a stronger contraction, right? So that's excitatory. If you are in an alpha 2, that response is inhibitory. So the same neurotransmitter, norepinephrine coming in, binding to an alpha 2, you would get relaxation of a smooth muscle. which could bronchodilate or vasodilate. You would get slowing down or turning off of the secretion of a gland, or maybe reducing the strength of a contraction of your cardiac muscle cell. So alpha 1s are excitatory, alpha 2s are inhibitory. Same neurotransmitter, but the cells are going to have different responses based on the type of receptor found at that tissue. Well, what's kind of cool is the pattern is the same for beta. So the beta 1s are excitatory, the beta 2s are inhibitory. Okay, so alpha 1s and beta 1s are excitatory, alpha 2s and beta 2s are inhibitory. Beta 3 is its kind of own standalone. It does adipose stimulation. It basically causes the releasing of fats. So I guess it would be considered excitatory. Okay. So what's interesting, or the application to this, is think about when you would do fight or flight. It was the excitation of certain things, but the shutting down of other things. So how can, if we're releasing the same neurotransmitter, we'll just pick norepinephrine because it's more widespread, how can releasing norepinephrine all over the body trigger some things to be excited and some things to be turned off, right? So like increase activity of your respiratory system, your cardiovascular system, when it's decreased activity of your digestive system. Well, it's because these receptors are distributed differently amongst different tissues. So when epinephrine is released or norepinephrine is released, depending on where that receptor is, you're going to have a different response. And we'll see that a little bit later when we get to dual innervation. All right, so that wraps up this video. I know it's kind of long, but I didn't really want to split up the whole discussion on sympathetic division. So hopefully you took breaks if you needed to. But that is it for the sympathetic division. Our next video will cover the parasympathetic division. All right, see you then. Bye.